This is Generous Theology, and for this episode, Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Chapter 20, The Nature of Change, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
Great point. Just to share with folks listening to us, just to share with them one example that I really found illuminating in this chapter and was so appreciative of the author's care in illustrating it, was this idea. We've talked about having an outfit, fabric, and patching the fabric, and eventually, many generations later, it still retains some semblance of it. It's still a shirt, it's still a pair of pants, it's still recognizably that, but it's so far from where it once was. And maybe from where the underlying prolegomena or understanding that the original person had in mind when they coined the phrase or used the term. And so here's the example from the text that I really liked, and that is on page 279. Let me read from there. We're going to go into the word nature, the concept of nature. And what does that mean? We have an idea today of what we mean by nature when we use it in a sentence, but let's go back and see how it germinated within Aristotle's works and developed. And by the way, it's not that Aristotle had a proprietary lock on the language, but absolutely he was influential. And I think even for the positive, even if I'm not an Aristotelian or not in the Aristotle camp. But let me read from the section here on 279. The physics, that's Aristotle's physics text, was only one of Aristotle's works on natural philosophy. But from the medieval perspective, it was the most important one. It was understood to provide a characterization of the most general principles and properties of things that are by nature. Okay, what is a cat by nature? What is a dog by nature? This is the sense of it. The professor continues, according to Aristotle, things that are by nature have an inner source of moving and being at rest. And so here you have it. There's something integral to the material objects themselves, something that Aristotle doesn't completely quantify, but he calls a nature. In other words, there's something to being a cat, catness, if you would like to put it that way. There's something to being a dog. There's something to being a human being, mankind. And there's this inner source that Aristotle is working around. And here's what he says. He thinks of nature as having an object that has an inner impulse to change. And it's this inner impulse. Why is it that material things should have within them an inner impulse? So first of all, it's interesting to note how we can use the word nature today in an Aristotelian sense when I talk about what it means for a dog to have a nature or a cat. There's something intuitively there for us to grab and hold on to. And Aristotle is talking about that something, even if he can't quite fully articulate what it is. But for him, it's inner to the object itself, to the cat, to the dog, and not what? External to it, as in a dominating transcendent principle or transcendent being. So we even think about common terms like nature in this way. And so this is the idea of matter having properties that are emergent. There's some impulse or nature inside of things that causes them to change and develop into new material thing. And that's what we're talking about with change. We showed last time how there really wasn't causality in a single theory of everything. Trying to explain causality in terms of one mode or one dimension really doesn't seem to be fruitful, because we found just in our short list 6 or 7 or 8 different categories of what it might mean to change. And so we talked about that periodic table of change that maybe ought to be the direction in which the science of causation should go when we're thinking about this. And to be fair, the medieval thinkers were trying to unify here. And their failure is, for me, the impetus to conclude that this table is necessary. I don't mean to say they failed because we're smart and they were dumb and they didn't see what's so obvious to us now. Rather, I think it's the other way around. Their failure indicates to me that from a human philosophical perspective, there probably isn't a theory of everything, at least in the sense that it's not a scientific thing. So when I'm a scientist and I'm a materialist and I want there to be a theory of everything and I'm researching towards that end, that in and of itself is not a scientific quantity. And it's the study of my motivation, which, by the way, also corresponds with a teleos. Clearly, I am bending my will, I'm bending my faculties of mind and body and the faculties that express under my control in my life, my scientific equipment to investigate things with. I'm clearly directing towards a purpose, in this case, the purpose of understanding reality. Chuck, you've tried to, perhaps, you've tried to put more clothes in a suitcase than maybe it could hold. And I almost feel like that's the case here with the Aristotelians. The more they try to put everything into inner impulses and emergent aspects of the material reality, and the more that they want to not go down the transcendent or the ideal or the form, it almost becomes the more obvious why their approach is lacking, in that they can't come up with explanations and principles that aren't themselves non-corporeal and refer to some hidden form or some transcendent meaning or some creator God or ultimate purpose or narrative or meta-narrative. And what an interesting struggle. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And I think it's why, when it comes down to brass tacks, when as Christians we are thinking about how to engage with non-Christian, that I think this area is one that could be very useful. Now, and exactly how we do that is going to be dependent. It's one thing when we're talking about philosophers who have grounding in Aristotle and grounding in the modern philosophies. It's different than when we're dealing with regular folks who are primarily focused on their families and on their work that they do. But there is a sense in which this idea of an ultimate direction, an ultimate teleos, is so very important. And I think you're right. You pointed out how we still use that word nature in that Aristotelian way when we talk about, but it's in the nature of a dog to want to please its master. It's in the nature of a cat to not want to please its master and to treat it like its master is actually its slave or whatever. And we use that terminology a lot. And it really does make some sense then to think about if a dog has a nature, if a cat has a nature, and it determines the direction of their life, how much more so then does a human have a nature? And what does that say about a direction of their life, and where does that come from? I think in the case, at least of dogs, I don't know about cats, but in the case of dogs, I've heard evolutionists try to make a case that the direction was imposed by nature around them, that in order to survive, the ancestors of dogs and wolves that became dogs had to, the ones that began to cooperate with humans, began to want to please humans around them. They were the ones who got fed, and the ones who did the various things that treating humans as their masters. They're the ones that survived. I think it's fair to say that we're always going to be able to point out that's not sufficient. There may be some directions that you can at least to go back a little ways on and point to outside influences from other species or from the environment. But there is so much more. And we as humans, I think, even non-Christians, even complete secularists, I think still sense, even if sometimes we don't want to acknowledge it, we have a sense that there is something innately human that is special, and that there is a teleos or a direction in our humanity that is meaningful, but it's got to come from somewhere. And where does that come from? And I think those kinds of discussions, it's useful for Christians to be prepared for those kinds of discussions when dealing with non-Christians in some of these bigger questions.